A prison guarded 24/7, walls reinforced with steel, cameras in every corner. No one gets in or out without being seen. But one morning, a guard opened the cell, and the prisoner was gone. No broken locks, no tunnel, no trace. Just one question hanging in the air. Where did he go? Today, we uncover the world's most baffling and mysterious prison escapes. Cases that still leave experts scratching their heads. On a fog-drenched night in June 1962, 3 prisoners vanished from the most secure prison in American history and were never seen again. Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, isolated in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay, was thought to be escape-proof. Its concrete walls, steel bars, and round-the-clock surveillance created a fortress built to contain the nation's most dangerous inmates. But Frank Morris, along with brothers Clarence and John Anglin, proved that even the rock had cracks. Over months of planning, the trio used stolen tools, makeshift drills, and sharpened spoons to dig through ventilation shafts hidden behind the walls of their cells. They fashioned life vests and a raft out of more than 50 stolen raincoats, carefully stitched and sealed with heat from steam pipes. Dummy heads, made from soap, toilet paper, and real human hair, were placed in their beds to fool the guards. On the night of June 11th, they slipped through a utility corridor, scaled a ventilation shaft, and disappeared into the dark water. By morning, their cells appeared undisturbed, until a routine check revealed the deception. Despite an extensive manhunt by the FBI, no conclusive trace of the men was ever found. A paddle, some personal belongings, and the remnants of their raft washed ashore, but no bodies. Were they swallowed by the icy currents? Or did they reach the mainland and vanish into new lives? More than 6 decades later, the bay keeps its secrets, and somewhere between the waves and the whispers, the question still drifts. Did they make it? In the heart of Nazi-occupied Poland, during the final years of World War II, Allied prisoners of war set into motion one of the most audacious escape attempts in military history. Stalag Luft III was designed to be escape-proof, a high-security POW camp built specifically for Allied airmen. It featured elevated huts to detect tunneling, seismograph microphones, and German guards trained in counter-escape tactics. But the men behind the wire had other plans. Led by squadron leader Roger Bushell, known as Big X, over 600 prisoners worked in total secrecy to dig not one, but 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry. Using makeshift tools, scavenged wood, and remarkable ingenuity, they built ventilation systems, pulley carts, and even electric lighting. The work was dangerous, slow, and claustrophobic, but it continued day and night. On the night of March 24, 1944, 76 men crawled through the narrow tunnel Harry, emerging just beyond the camp's perimeter. But the escape, years in the making, faltered. The tunnel fell short of the tree line, the process was slower than planned, and guards eventually discovered the breach. 73 of the escapees were captured. Hitler, enraged, ordered 50 of them executed, a war crime that would resonate across history. Only 3 men made it to freedom. Though the escape fell short of its intended scale, it was a triumph of human spirit, defiance, and meticulous coordination. The tunnel collapsed long ago. The camp has faded into ruins, but the story remains. In silence and soil, the memory of their daring lives on, a reminder that even in captivity, the will to be free cannot be buried. On a quiet summer morning in June 1977, inside an unassuming courtroom in Aspen, Colorado, one of America's most infamous killers vanished, without warning, without help, and without a trace. Ted Bundy had already become a figure of national unease. Arrested and awaiting trial for the brutal murder of a young woman, he represented a chilling contradiction. Charismatic, educated, and deeply dangerous. But that day, in the law library of the Pitkin County Courthouse, Bundy saw an opening, literally. Left unshackled, under minimal supervision, he asked to do legal research. For hours, he paced, studied, and waited. When no one was looking, he climbed onto a bookshelf, slipped out an open second-story window, and dropped to the ground below, vanishing into the nearby aspen wilderness. A massive manhunt ensued. Authorities scoured the forests, mountains, and roads, unsure if Bundy had planned this escape or simply acted on impulse. For 6 days, he eluded capture, surviving in the cold, stealing food and clothing, even breaking into a cabin. But hunger and exposure eventually weakened him. Police recaptured him while he was driving a stolen car outside Aspen. His freedom was over this time, but the escape was only the beginning. Less than 6 months later, Bundy would break out again with deadlier consequences. And so, in a courthouse built for justice, a killer stepped through a window and into legend. The pain he slipped through is long gone, but the question lingers. How many lives might have been spared if he hadn't made that jump? On the night of July 11, 2015, the most powerful drug lord in the Western Hemisphere vanished again. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, leader of the Sinaloa cartel, was being held in Mexico's most secure prison, Altiplano Federal Facility. Isolated, monitored, and surrounded by reinforced concrete, the prison was considered impenetrable. But beneath its foundations, something else was taking shape. Surveillance footage showed Guzman pacing in his cell, disappearing behind a partition in the shower area, the only blind spot from the cameras. And then, nothing. He never came back into frame. What authorities discovered hours later defied belief. A hole beneath the shower floor led to a sophisticated, mile-long tunnel. It was lit, ventilated, and wide enough for a man to ride a modified motorcycle along tracks, custom-built for the escape. The tunnel ended at a half-constructed house in a rural neighborhood, beyond the prison walls. The operation had required months, if not years, of planning, heavy equipment, and inside coordination. The timing was precise, the design professional, and the implications staggering. As news broke, it shook Mexico's justice system and embarrassed its leadership. This wasn't the first time El Chapo had escaped prison, but this was the most calculated, cinematic, and brazen. He would eventually be recaptured, extradited to the United States, and locked away in a supermax facility. But for 24 hours, the world watched in disbelief as a man disappeared through a hole in the floor and re-emerged as a legend. And in that silence beneath the cell, the tunnel remains a monument not just to escape, but to the machinery of power, wealth, and fear that built it. In the skies above southern France, the whir of helicopter blades once signaled more than transportation. It marked the beginning of one of the most daring prison breaks in modern history. Pascal Payet, convicted of murder and armed robbery, was no ordinary inmate. Known for his leadership in violent heists, he soon earned a reputation as a man who refused to be caged. In July 2001, Payet made his first escape from Luynes prison by helicopter. Accomplices hijacked a civilian aircraft, forced the pilot to land in the prison yard, and lifted Payet into the air before guards could react. He was caught just months later, but the story didn't end there. In 2003, while back behind bars, Payet organized another airborne escape, not for himself but for 3 fellow inmates. Once again, a hijacked helicopter descended into the prison courtyard, and once again, it flew away before anyone could stop it. Security measures were tightened. Payet was transferred repeatedly, isolated, watched constantly. But on July 14, 2007, Bastille Day, he did it again. A helicopter, commandeered by armed men in disguise, landed in Grasse prison. Within minutes, Payet was airborne, disappearing into the open sky for a third time. This time, the freedom was short-lived. He was captured after a manhunt spanning multiple countries. Today, he remains locked in solitary confinement under extraordinary security. But somewhere between steel bars and open skies, Pascal Payet redefined the meaning of escape. And every rotating blade overhead still echoes the question: if the sky is within reach, can any prison truly hold? In the shadowed cells of Japan's toughest prisons, one man defied walls, guards, and steel bars, not once but 4 times. Yoshie Shiratori was no hardened criminal by nature. Accused of a murder he insisted he didn't commit, he spent much of his life behind bars. But what set Shiratori apart was not just his will to survive. It was his extraordinary ability to escape. His first break came in 1936, from Aomori prison. Using a length of wire and patience earned through despair, he picked the lock, slipped past the guards, and vanished into the night. Recaptured and sent to Akita prison. More secure, more brutal, he did it again. This time, through a narrow air vent. His shoulders dislocated to squeeze through, his spirit unbroken. Transferred to Abashiri prison in Hokkaido, Japan's version of Alcatraz, he faced sub-zero temperatures, solitary confinement, and iron shackles. He studied the patterns of rust, the timing of guards, the bend of the metal. In 1944, he escaped once more. After loosening handcuffs and climbing a wall in the dead of winter. Each escape was different, each more improbable than the last. And every time, the myth of Yoshie Shiratori grew. He would eventually be caught again, but not forgotten. Today, his name echoes through Japanese folklore as a symbol of endurance and defiance. The prisons still stand, but his story slips through the bars, a reminder that even within cold walls, the human spirit can find a way out. In the early hours of June 6, 2015, 2 convicted murderers vanished from behind the walls of one of America's oldest and most secure prisons, leaving behind nothing but silence and a trail of mystery. Richard Matt and David Sweat were serving life sentences inside Clinton Correctional Facility, a massive, fortress-like structure nestled in the Adirondacks of upstate New York. For months, the pair had been digging through steel and stone, hidden behind the walls of their cells. With smuggled tools and remarkable patience, they cut through pipes, tunneled under catwalks, and navigated a maze of utility corridors. Their escape route wound deep through the prison's underbelly, out of sight, but not without sound. When they emerged, they had slipped past 30-foot walls and guard towers, leaving behind neatly folded clothes and paper dummies in their beds. Even more startling was the revelation that the plan had help. Joyce Mitchell, a civilian employee at the prison, was seduced into providing tools and support. A second employee was also implicated, raising questions about corruption and complacency within the system. For 3 weeks, a manhunt stretched across the region. Roads were sealed, helicopters combed the forests, and towns locked their doors. Matt was shot and killed by law enforcement. Sweat was wounded and captured days later. But the damage had been done. The escape exposed critical flaws in prison operations, shocked the nation, and reignited fears of what lies behind bars. In the end, they didn't find freedom. But for 22 days, 2 men walked outside the walls of an institution built to contain them, and the echo of their footsteps still lingers in the tunnels beneath Clinton. On September 25, 1983, the walls of Her Majesty's Maze Prison, the most secure facility in Northern Ireland, were breached not with explosives, but with deception, discipline, and a stolen truck. At the height of the Troubles, Maze Prison held hundreds of inmates affiliated with paramilitary groups. Among them were members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army, highly organized, intensely loyal, and determined to escape. For months, they studied guard routines, smuggled in weapons, and planned every detail. On that autumn afternoon, 38 IRA prisoners launched their escape from H Block 7. Armed with smuggled guns and makeshift knives, they overpowered guards, hijacked a prison food delivery lorry, and drove it straight out through the main gate. The operation was swift and brutally efficient. 1 prison officer was stabbed, several were beaten, and nearly 24 were later treated for injuries. In just under half an hour, the largest prison escape in British history had taken place. The fallout was immediate. Massive roadblocks were set up across Northern Ireland. Helicopters scanned the countryside. Some escapees were caught within hours. Others vanished into sympathetic networks, crossing borders and, in some cases, disappearing for years. The British government faced fierce criticism. The escape not only undermined the perceived security of the maze, but also reignited tensions in a region already stretched thin by violence and political unrest. Decades later, the names and faces of those 38 men still evoke strong reactions, heroic to some, criminal to others. But the cold concrete of H Block 7 bears witness to one undeniable truth. Even the most fortified walls can fall, if the will to escape is strong enough. On the afternoon of November 2, 1979, the quiet routines of New Jersey's Clinton Correctional Facility for women were shattered. Armed intruders stormed the grounds, overpowered guards, and freed a woman whose name had already become a symbol of resistance and controversy. Assata Shakur. Born Joan Kezimard, she was a former member of the Black Panther Party and an active figure in the Black Liberation Army. In 1973, she was arrested after a shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike that left a state trooper dead. Shakur was wounded, captured, and later convicted of murder, despite ongoing claims that she had been unjustly targeted and framed. For 6 years, she remained behind bars. Then, with precision and planning, members of the BLA executed an escape. Disguised visitors arrived with concealed weapons, took hostages, and moved decisively through the prison. Within minutes, Shakur was gone. The escape was flawless. She vanished from the American penal system and from public view. Years later, U.S. authorities confirmed what many suspected. She had fled to Cuba, where she was granted political asylum. From there, she continued to speak out against racial injustice and U.S. policy, while remaining a fugitive on the FBI's most wanted terrorists list. To some, she is a revolutionary in exile. To others, a convicted killer on the run. But her escape remains one of the most politically charged prison breaks in U.S. history. An operation that defied security, defied expectation, and left behind a question that still divides public memory. Is Assata Shakur a fugitive from justice or a survivor of injustice? On a calm Sunday morning in July 2018, the skies above a French prison thundered with rotor blades, and within minutes, one of the country's most notorious criminals vanished into the air. Rédoine Faïd, a career gangster and master of disguise, was serving a 25-year sentence at Row Prison near Paris for armed robbery and the murder of a police officer. Known for his obsession with Hollywood heist films, Faïd had already escaped once before in 2013. Authorities believed he had been contained. They were wrong. At 11:15 a.m., a hijacked helicopter landed in the prison courtyard, an area where inmates were not even supposed to be. 2 heavily armed men emerged, detonated smoke grenades, and cut through locked gates with power tools. Within 10 minutes, Faïd was aboard and the helicopter lifted off, disappearing over the prison walls. The pilot, taken hostage earlier that morning, was released unharmed. The helicopter was later found abandoned in a field south of Paris, scorched and stripped. The escape was surgical, cinematic, and utterly humiliating for the French justice system. A nationwide manhunt followed, spanning weeks and hundreds of officers. Faïd was eventually captured in a suburban apartment north of Paris, disguised in a burqa, hidden among associates, but still unbroken in spirit. Once again, he was locked away, this time under maximum security and round-the-clock surveillance. But the echo of spinning blades over row still haunts French prisons, a reminder that even in modern incarceration, the impossible can still take flight. And for those watching from the ground, the question remains: was it his last escape, or merely his boldest? In late December 2019, as the world prepared for a new year, a quiet but astonishing vanishing act unfolded across international borders, one that began in a Tokyo courtroom and ended in the diplomatic shadows of Beirut. Carlos Ghosn, once the celebrated CEO of Nissan and Renault, had fallen from grace. Charged in Japan with financial misconduct, he was under strict bail conditions, monitored, confined, and under constant surveillance. Escape seemed impossible, but on December 29th, Ghosn disappeared from his home without triggering a single alarm. The plan, months in the making, was executed with precision and audacity. Disguised and assisted by a covert team, he was hidden inside a black box, normally used to transport large concert audio equipment. That box, loaded onto a private jet at Osaka's Kansai airport, bypassed inspection thanks to a loophole in Japan's cargo screening for private flights. By the time authorities realized what had happened, the jet was already en route to Turkey. And then to Lebanon. Lebanon, where Ghosn holds citizenship, has no extradition treaty with Japan. And within hours, he appeared in public, defiant, unrepentant, and free. Japan's justice system was left reeling. Security protocols were questioned. The international business world watched, stunned. And Ghosn's critics and defenders alike were left to debate. Was this the desperate escape of a guilty man, or the liberation of someone who refused to trust a broken system? The box he vanished in is now infamous. Silent, sturdy, and just large enough to carry a man, and a secret the size of a scandal. In March 1965, a puff of smoke drifted through the cold Montreal air, and behind it, Canada's most wanted man disappeared. Lucien Rivard, a convicted drug trafficker with deep ties to international crime syndicates, had been held at Bordeaux jail, awaiting extradition to the United States. Considered a high-risk prisoner, Rivard had already spent years navigating the shadows of narcotics, gambling, and arms smuggling. But what happened next would shake Canadian politics to its core. One chilly evening, Rivard simply walked out of the prison gates. Using a water hose as a makeshift rope, he scaled a wall and vanished into the night. No alarms, no chase, no trace. At first, it seemed like just another bold escape. But as days turned to weeks, questions began piling up. How had a high-profile inmate fled from a supposedly secure facility? Why were security protocols ignored? And who had helped him? Soon, whispers of political interference began to surface. Members of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson's government were accused of inappropriate communications with Rivard's legal team. The scandal intensified when it emerged that Rivard had ties to political insiders and may have received special treatment. Amid the public outrage, 2 cabinet ministers resigned. The phrase "the Rivard affair" entered Canadian political vocabulary, symbolizing a moment when crime, corruption, and government credibility collided. Rivard was eventually captured months later in Havana, Cuba, and extradited back to Canada. But his escape had already left its mark, not just on prison walls, but on the fabric of Canadian politics. And in that quiet moment he slipped away, hose in hand. Rivard didn't just escape a jail, he ignited a national firestorm. In the summer of 1977, a man whose name was already etched in American tragedy vanished from Tennessee's Brushy Mountain State Penitentiary, and for 54 hours, the assassin of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was free. James Earl Ray had been serving a 99-year sentence for the 1968 murder of the civil rights leader. Held in one of the most secure facilities in the state, Ray was considered a high-risk inmate, watched, isolated, and deeply resented. Yet that didn't stop him from attempting what many thought impossible. On June 10th, Ray and 6 other inmates cut through a barbed wire fence during a prison recreation period. Using makeshift tools, careful timing, and a shared desperation, they slipped into the thick Appalachian woods surrounding the prison. The breakout triggered an immediate manhunt. Helicopters circled overhead, bloodhounds tracked the forest floor, and over 200 officers combed the rugged terrain. For more than 2 days, Ray evaded capture, surviving in the wilderness just miles from the prison. But freedom didn't last. On June 13th, Ray was spotted and apprehended by a tracking team. Weakened, disoriented, and exhausted, he was returned to custody without resistance. The escape raised serious concerns about prison security and fueled public outrage. For a man already vilified by history, the attempt added another layer to his infamy. Proof that even from behind bars, James Earl Ray still cast a long and troubling shadow. And though the fences were repaired and protocols rewritten, that narrow window of freedom remains a haunting footnote in the legacy of a man whose single act had changed the course of American history. In post-war Britain, as law and order tried to regain control, one man repeatedly slipped through its grasp, earning a nickname that still echoes through criminal folklore, the Houdini of Dartmoor. Alfred George Hines wasn't a violent man, but he was a master thief and an even more masterful escape artist. Convicted of robbery in the early 1950s and sentenced to 12 years in Dartmoor prison, Hines refused to let prison walls define his fate. His first escape came with cunning simplicity. In 1955, during a routine job cleaning toilets, he unlocked a door, scaled a 20-foot wall, and vanished. For over 6 months, he traveled Europe using forged papers and lived under an assumed identity, until he was caught in Ireland. Returned to prison, Hines didn't stop planning. During his trial for escape, he used a legal loophole to get access to court documents, then locked himself in a bathroom, escaped through a skylight, and fled down a rope ladder. He was caught again. But his third and most stunning escape happened in 1957 from Chelmsford Prison. This time, he simply walked out using a duplicate key he'd secretly crafted from memory. Hines stayed free for over 2 years, living openly under an alias, even launching a legal battle to clear his name. His deep knowledge of the legal system and flair for defiance earned public fascination and frustration from authorities. Eventually, he was captured again. But by then, Alfred Hines had already become a legend. A man who didn't break out with brute force, but with intellect, nerve, and precision. To this day, his escapes remain some of the most daring in British history, and proof that sometimes the sharpest tool isn't a lockpick, it's the mind behind it. By 1970, Ronnie Biggs was already infamous, one of the central figures in Britain's Great Train Robbery of 1963, a crime that stunned the nation and netted over £2.6 million in stolen cash. Sentenced to 30 years in prison, Biggs was locked away in London's Wandsworth prison, but not for long. On July 8th, just 15 months into his sentence, Biggs escaped. During a routine exercise period, he climbed a 30-foot prison wall using a rope ladder thrown from the outside. At the top, he leapt into a waiting furniture van and was gone within seconds. The timing, planning, and coordination were flawless. Biggs fled the country using forged documents, eventually making his way through France and Spain before settling in Australia. But the law was never far behind. In 1974, as pressure mounted, he vanished again, this time resurfacing in Brazil, a country with no extradition treaty with the UK. He lived there openly for decades, becoming both a media sensation and a symbol of defiant escape. Tourists visited him. He recorded songs with punk bands. All the while, British authorities watched, powerless to bring him home. In 2001, aging and in poor health, Biggs voluntarily returned to the UK, where he was arrested upon arrival and sent back to prison. He served several more years before being released on compassionate grounds. Ronnie Biggs didn't just escape a prison. He eluded a nation, outlasted the chase, and blurred the line between criminal and folk legend. And for over 30 years, he lived not just as a fugitive, but as a reminder that some stories refuse to stay behind bars. Few escape artists in modern history have combined charm, deception, and sheer audacity quite like Stephen J. Russell, a man whose real-life exploits inspired the film I Love You, Philip Morris, and who remains one of the most cunning prison escapees the United States has ever seen. Russell wasn't a hardened criminal. He began as a seemingly ordinary man, church organist, police officer, father. But after coming out as gay, his life took a sharp turn into the world of elaborate cons, fraud, and deception. His real genius, though, wasn't just in swindling money. It was in escaping custody again and again. In the 1990s, Russell pulled off a string of near-unbelievable prison breaks. He faked a heart attack, altered medical records, impersonated a judge, and even posed as his own lawyer to secure a fake bail. Each time, he manipulated paperwork, voices, and identities with meticulous detail, escaping not through violence, but through pure intellect and improvisation. His most daring escape came from a Texas prison, where he forged medical records to convince authorities he was dying of AIDS. He was granted compassionate release, only to be rearrested once the ruse unraveled. In all, Russell escaped prison 4 times, often leaving guards and officials bewildered in his wake. His crimes were nonviolent, his methods theatrical, and his motivation at times deeply personal, especially when tied to his love for fellow inmate Philip Morris. Today, Stephen J. Russell is locked away in solitary confinement under 23-hour lockdown, classified as a high escape risk. But his legend still circulates in law enforcement circles as the man who didn't need weapons or force, just paper, persuasion, and an unstoppable will. Because sometimes the sharpest escape tools are words. In the heart of the Cold War, one of Britain's most dangerous traitors vanished from one of its most secure prisons, and the manhunt that followed would haunt British intelligence for decades. George Blake, once a loyal MI6 officer, had become a Soviet double agent during the Korean War. Over the years, he betrayed countless Western agents to the KGB, many of whom were imprisoned or executed. In 1961, he was arrested, tried in secret, and sentenced to an unprecedented 42 years in London's Wormwood Scrubs prison. But Blake wasn't done yet. In 1966, aided by fellow inmates and peace activists on the outside, he orchestrated a daring escape. While others distracted the guards, Blake slipped through a window, climbed over a wall using a makeshift rope ladder, and fled into the streets of London. Hidden in safe houses for months, Blake was eventually smuggled across Europe inside a wooden box fitted into the back of a camper van. He crossed into East Germany undetected, and from there into the waiting arms of the Soviet Union. The escape shocked British authorities not just because of who escaped, but because of how easily it was done. MI6 had lost one of the most high-profile spies of the century, and the Kremlin had gained a propaganda victory. Blake spent the rest of his life in Moscow, unrepentant, celebrated by Russian officials, and insulated from extradition. To Britain, he was a traitor who had walked out of prison and into history. To the USSR, he was a loyal soldier of ideology. And to the shadowy world of espionage, George Blake's escape proved one thing: loyalty can be traded, but freedom sometimes has a price no wall can contain.